Hello and welcome to a set of how to play videos for I Napoleon from GMT Games. I Napoleon is a card-driven game that allows you to live out the life of one of history's greatest figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. You start the game, or at least the campaign game, with Bonaparte as commander, and you're seeking to outdo his historical life and career as you seek glory on and off the battlefield. This is not a game that you win or lose in the traditional sense. Rather, once the game ends, you reflect on your achievements and assess how you did relative to history's Napoleon using a set of outcomes that the game provides. Even if you don't outperform history's Napoleon, and that's not easy to do, you can still enjoy crafting the narrative of a man's life along the way. So with that introduction, we're going to take a look at the components and some of the basic concepts in the game as a starting point. We'll be using this tabletop simulator module I created, which should be available shortly after the game is released. I'm not going to cover game setup. That's amply described in the playbook, and the tabletop simulator mod is all set up for the campaign game. And I will mention that there are some other shorter scenarios available. The TTS mod doesn't automate setup for those, but if there's enough call for it, maybe I'll add that in the future. Let's start by talking about glory. Glory is probably the most important concept in the game, and it's your objective, so it's a good place to start. Glory is tracked throughout the game, and it rises and falls along with effects and events in the game. And you track glory by moving this counter, the G on it for glory, along this track. If you ever get past 50, you can flip it to this plus 50 side and continue tracking above 50 glory. And if you ever reach 100 glory, you get to take this marker here and place it in this limits of glory space. So if you do exceptionally well and reach 100 glory at any moment in the game, that achievement remains with you for the rest of the game, even if glory subsequently drops below 100. And having this marker here affects the outcome at the end of the game, which we'll talk about in a little bit. By contrast, if you ever do so poorly that glory reaches 0 when you are first consul or emperor, you're deposed and the game ends immediately. Which is a good segue into discussing the various eras in the campaign game. You start the game in the commander era using the commander deck, where all of the cards have red highlights like this one here. This is known as CMD in the rules, and I'll refer to it as CMD a lot in this video. During this era, you represent General Bonaparte, and you're going to attempt to succeed in command of smaller campaigns and expeditions, and build a base of glory that will allow you to take part in the coup of 18 Brumaire and become first consul. At which point you'll advance into the first consul era. You'll add cards from the first consul deck to the game. Those are cards that have this blue highlight. And this represents you, Napoleon, as first consul and eventually first consul for life. And during this era, you first have to contend with foreign diplomacy and domestic politics, as well as leading much larger military campaigns. But with enough glory, you can become first consul for life and then pass an imperial plebiscite, after which you become emperor. Which leads us to the game's final era, the Emperor era, where you add the Emperor deck cards, or EMD in this case. And this is the final era, and during this era, you're going to guide France through the Napoleonic Wars as you attempt to solidify your power, succession, and your legacy. So now let's talk about how the game ends and what you do with all the glory and accomplishments you've amassed during play and how you determine how well you've done. And there's essentially 5 ways the game can end. We've already talked about one of them, which is if during the first consul era or the emperor era, glory reaches 0, you're deposed and the game ends there. At the end of the final year on the year track, which is actually representing the years 1871 to 1821, at the end of that year, the game also ends immediately. Events on cards which result in Napoleon being killed or deposed. As you can see on this card, he's killed, and on this card, he's overthrown. Events like that also end the game immediately. You'll see the card will very clearly say the game ends. There's also a set of cards in the game where you have a choice to end the game by playing that card or choosing one version of that card. Now, you're probably asking, why would you want to do that? But the short answer is, if you feel like you're kind of in a position where this is as good as it's going to get, you might want to choose to end the game on your own terms. These three cards I'm showing here, these are the main three that do this. If the game ends in any one of those ways, you come over here and check this chart and look for the outcome described here that best describes your game. So for example, if you die before you even reach the rank of general, your outcome is that you're a minor foot to history, and you can go to that section of the rules and kind of read the description of what that means. By contrast, if it ends with you on the throne with a legitimate heir, you're the founder of a dynasty. And obviously, if you reach 100 glory at any point during the game, you, in addition, get the bonus that you've extended the limits of glory. There is one other way the game can end, which is really the historical way that Napoleon ended, which is abdication. So if results go against you on the battlefield, you can end up being forced to fight this campaign, and if you're defeated in this campaign, you are forced to abdicate. Once you're forced to abdicate, you follow this section in the rules. There's a whole process for abdication, and at some point during that process, the game will end, and it will tell you what the outcome is as a result of that ending during the abdication process. But abdication doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen in every game. So if it happens to you, just go to the rules and follow that process. So we've already talked about glory, but glory is also what's known as in the game as a resource point. And there are 4 resource points in the game. There's administrative, diplomatic, glory, and political. And all of these points are tracked by moving these counters along the general records track. All of them have a plus 50 side, though I will say the way the game works, glory is really the only one that will ever get above 50. There's no realistic possibility for the others to get above 50. If it happens, trust me, you've got a story to tell. But with all of them, you will see them rise and fall based on cards that you draw. There's a period of the game where you get the points added for you based on cards that are in location boxes. We'll talk more about what that means in a second. You'll be given options to spend them to get benefits in the game or to avoid adverse effects in the game. So they all have that general use, but beyond that, each of them has a primary use. Administrative points are the main way that you assign commanders to your campaigns. And I'll talk later in the next video how important Napoleon's commanders are to success in campaigns. But for now, just know that you want to have as many as possible available to you when you reach the campaign resolution phase. I'll mention there are a few commanders in the game who you assign by spending glory or political points, but admin points are the most important resource for this. Diplomacy points, as the name implies, are used to influence other nations. Specifically, you want them available during the diplomatic phase if you want to try to prevent foreign relations from deteriorating with your main rivals in the game. Political points are used to influence a role that you make during the domestic politics phase, which usually robs you of glory because domestic politics are so messy for Napoleon. So you'll want to have some on hand to mitigate that loss of glory every year. Next, let's talk about Napoleon's luck, which is represented by this marker here. And let's be honest, you don't achieve greatness without a little luck along the way. Every turn, Napoleon can use his luck once and only once. Once you use it, you flip the counter over to indicate that you've used it, and you can't use it again until the next game year. So choose wisely. Now you can use Napoleon's luck for the following. First, during the campaign resolution phase, you can use it instead of paying the cost, admin, glory, or political, of a card that you want to have available, such as a commander. Frankly, you probably won't use it for this in anything other than dire circumstances, but it is an option that's available to you. Second, during the card action phase, you can ignore any mandatory card that you just drew and redraw to get a new card instead. There are some cards in the deck that can just ruin your day or ruin your plans, and you're going to have to make tough decisions about when to use Napoleon's Luck for this purpose. Because most critically, the third use of Napoleon's Luck is to re-roll any one die roll. And generally speaking, you'll want Napoleon's Luck available when you're rolling to see what happens in a campaign, just in case. Which is why spending it beforehand can be such an agonizing decision. But you could need it to keep a card from coming into the game, or you could need it because you have to re-roll a bit of bad luck that resulted in Napoleon's premature death as well. So at the end of the day, you just have to choose wisely when to use it. Now let's look at the game board. Most of this amazing looking board is made up of what are known as location boxes. All of these are location boxes. Now, some location boxes, the ones in blue, actually represent locations like the Americas or Britain or France. Some of them over here in red represent political offices, and there's one for Napoleon himself. Some of the other ones in red represent your family and your mistresses. And finally, there's a row of location boxes for cards that will influence this year's campaign, if there is one, and where all of the current treaties in the game are placed. And we're going to talk more about what you do with cards when they're in these boxes later, but for now, just know that cards will go into these boxes in one of two primary ways. The first is, and you would expect this, when you draw a card during the card action phase, which we'll cover in detail later, a lot of them, the thing that they tell you to do is to place them in a location boxes. In some cases, you can choose to place it or not. In other cases, you have to place it there. There's also moments in the game where cards get added to the deck. Primarily, this happens during certain years of the game or when you switch eras in the game. And some of the cards that you are adding to the game go into location boxes instead of going into the deck. When you're adding new cards to the game, some of them get placed directly into location boxes, either face up or face down. When it's face up, you can use the card right away. When it's face down, the back of the card will provide instructions about what needs to happen for the card to be placed face up. But you can easily find these cards because unlike the regular deck, they have unique backs, and that back both tells you where it gets placed and whether it's face up or face down. And then if it is placed face down, it will tell you what you need to do in order to be able to flip it face up and make it available for use. When you're adding cards for FCD and EMD, there's a special pair of cards. There's potential treaties and potential campaigns, which get placed off to the right of the board in these areas here. There's quite a few of these in both of these eras, so you're going to place them here and turn them face up, and we'll talk about why they're here and what you do with them later. To finish our discussion of the map, I'm just going to mention the diplomacy tracks, which is where you track your current relations with Britain, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. We'll talk more about that in detail later. Cards are the heart of I Napoleon, driving the narrative and your fate as you'd expect from a card-driven game. Each card kind of represents a person, a place, or an event in Napoleon's life, and the card text will provide instructions on what to do when it's revealed, the effects that the card has, and in some cases, like the results of a die roll to determine what effect that the card has. So when you turn a card up, when you first draw a card, obviously the first thing you're going to want to look at is the when revealed instructions, and that'll tell you what to do with the card when it first enters play. There's two things you're going to want to look for very carefully right away. The first one is whether the card is mandatory or not. If the when revealed instructions say may, then the card is not mandatory. So you get to choose whether you want to place this card in commanders or not. This card, by contrast, contains the word must, or the when revealed instructions contain the word must. This card is mandatory. If you are able to play this card, then you must play a mandatory card. Apart from when revealed instructions, the other thing you will find on a lot of cards in I Napoleon are effects. And effects are things that will happen after the card is placed in a location box. And there's a few that you'll see a lot, so I'm going to talk about what those are so you know what to look out for. The first is campaign effects. So you can see here that the campaign effect of this card is +1 die roll modifier in all combat rounds after the first. That is obviously something that's going to take effect during the campaign resolution phase. Similarly, there's a combat effect in which you can spend an admin point to gain a +1 DRM in the first combat round. Once those are placed either in the campaign box or in the strategy and tactics box, those effects can happen. Some cards will have what are known as ongoing effects. These are effects that are active at all times until the card is removed from its location box. And cards with this type of effect are typically going to have this little sort of symbol in the top left indicating that there's an ongoing effect that you have to be aware of and look out for at certain points in the game. A sort of special type of ongoing effect is an income effect. These operate pretty much the same way as ongoing effects, except their impact is limited to adding resource points at the beginning of a game turn. And finally, there's triggered effects. These are effects that are either triggered by a certain game state or a game phase. In this example, you can trigger this during the domestic politics phase, or they'll have effects that you can trigger during the card action phase. And we'll talk about that in more detail in another video, but there's a specific moment during the card action phase where you can look around the board for any cards with a triggered effect and you can trigger them at that time. And then the last thing I'm going to mention about cards is that at the bottom they have add and remove instructions. So on the left will tell you when this card is added. Usually that's a year or an era. In this one case, it's added if card 29 is played. And then on the right side, it will tell you what causes this card to be removed from the game. Now, it's really well described in the rules, so I'm going to say you're better off going to the rules to read that to understand any of the nuances as it relates to adding and removing cards. But I will point out the symbol on this card. This indicates that when the card is played, this card is removed from the game. So cards that show this symbol are essentially one-shot, one-use cards. So to end this first video, I'm going to walk you through the sequence of play, sort of. The two places that you'll spend most of your time in the game are the card action phase, phase 3, and the campaign resolution phase, phase 4. They're involved, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain those two phases in detail in the next video. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the other phases in detail right now, and then I'll only mention in this video at a high level what happens during those phases. But we start with the year setup phase, and as you would expect, this is where you basically set everything up to play another year in the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. So the first thing you do is you advance the year marker one space along the year track representing a year passing. And then you take the card draw marker from wherever it is on the card draw track and you move it back here to the one space. Now, I realize at this point you have no idea how it got to that other space, but for now just know that you move it back to the one space as you reset for a new turn. Next, you scan the board looking for any cards that provide an income effect. Remember, we talked about those earlier. I will mention that the game includes these markers that you can place on these cards, which make it a little bit easier to spot cards with income effects and exactly how much you get. So you total up all of the income effects from cards that are in play, and then you adjust your resource points by that amount. So in the case I was just showing, I would increase my admin points by 2. Now, when we talk about income effects, mostly we're talking about admin, diplomacy, and politics points, but I will mention that there are a few cards with income effects that affect your glory. Like, for example, your idiot relatives, who, if you don't essentially get them out of France and into some other location, will cost you glory every single turn. And then there's this guy, who's a major pain in the neck. And then finally, for the year setup phase, If you're not happy with how many admin points you have available, you can exchange 1 political point for 1 admin point, or 3 glory points for 1 admin point. This is the only time you can make these particular exchanges. There are some other exchanges which are available at other times. Trust me, it makes sense when you see it. Just remember, during this phase, if you want, you can get a few extra admin points at the cost of either politics points or glory. Now, I know at this point you don't exactly know why you would want to do that, but trust me that admin points are pretty important. So now we move to the card deck phase. And during this phase, what you're basically doing is prepping the deck in order to play the upcoming year. So the first things that you're going to do are you're going to remove any cards that need to be removed. Mostly this is cards that get removed during the current game year or because you're switching eras. And then after that, you will add any cards which are coming into the game, again, usually because it's a specific year or you're moving into a new era. Now, in terms of removing cards, you can just go through the discard pile in the deck and you can look for any cards which say need to be removed in a specific year or during a specific era change, and you can pull them all out. What I typically like to do is just, make sure I'm checking as I turn up new cards. And if I get a card like this one that, for example, needs to be removed in 1796, if it's 1796 or beyond, I'll just say, okay, well, I'm just removing that from the game, and then I'll draw another card as a replacement for that card. And then finally, I'll mention that while even in the TTS module, removing cards is something that you need to do manually, adding cards has been automated. So when you switch to the Emperor era, you can just click this button and all of the cards will place themselves in the right locations for when they get added during that era. With one exception, that's the only time that cards are added to or removed from the deck in the game. The one exception is this card, Robespierre's Fall. So be on the lookout for this card, card 29. When this happens, you actually stop what you're doing, add and remove the cards that you need to remove based on the when revealed instructions here, shuffle everything back together, and then you continue on from that point. It's explained pretty well in the rules as well, but just be on the lookout for this card. And then to finish this phase, you simply put the discards back into the draw deck, shuffle it all together to make a new draw deck. Just to be clear about that, every year the discards go back into the deck, so you start every year with a deck that contains every card that it's possible for there to be in the game at that moment. Next, we move into the card action phase. And again, I'm going to explain this in a lot more detail in the next video, but in brief, during this phase, you're going to draw cards and do what they tell you to do. You'll follow the when revealed instructions, figure out where to place them, figure out what to do. Maybe you'll get a valuable commander that you can use in your upcoming campaign, or maybe something bad will befall you in the campaign. Maybe another leader or general will emerge on the world stage to challenge you, or maybe you'll have to make a difficult choice, or maybe you have to roll a die to see what happens. But you keep drawing cards and doing what they tell you to do until a die roll tells you to stop drawing cards. I'll explain what that means when we talk about the card action phase, but the upshot of it is that you actually never know how much or how little time you'll have every year, because you don't know how many cards you're going to draw in any given year. You'll always draw 5, you'll never draw more than 12, but within that range, you don't know how many cards each turn is going to contain. Next up is the other central phase of the game, the campaign resolution phase, and one which, again, we'll cover in more detail in the next video. For now, I'll just say that you are going to resolve whatever campaign is in the campaign location box. That's this box right here. So whatever card is in this box, you're going to resolve that campaign. I'll mention here that sometimes that box will be empty, in which case you skip most of this phase, but you're Napoleon, you're fighting a lot. It's often filled. And so basically, you resolve it by playing cards from these other boxes, your commanders, campaign modifiers, strategy and tactics, to get a die roll modifier for the current round of combat. And then you roll a die, add the die roll modifier, and then determine the outcome of the campaign using this combat resolution table. Victory is going to bring you glory, and it's going to shift the diplomatic picture, often dramatically. Stalemate is an inconclusive result, which costs you some glory and means that you have to fight another combat round to try to resolve the campaign without many of the cards that you already spent to get a die roll modifier that first time. And defeat will cost you, often seriously. In addition, you might end up having a bloody result, which basically means a result with a high body count, and in that case, it makes your domestic political situation a little bit worse because people get tired of wars when the body count is too high. At any rate, we'll cover both of those phases in detail in the next video. Next up is the diplomatic phase, and this is a phase that you only do when you are in the First Consul era or the Emperor era. FCD or EMD only. And it makes sense. Napoleon as a general wasn't in charge of France's diplomatic relations with the rest of Europe. But during FCD, you have to track every year what happens in your relations with France's main rivals. Now, Britain is always hostile, so you're not going to do anything with them. But for the remaining 4 nations that you're tracking, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, every time you are in this phase, you're going to roll a die for that nation, if it's eligible, and see if your relation gets worse or stays the same. Now, you can spend your diplomatic resource points during this phase to add +1 to the die roll. You can add as many diplomatic points as you have, getting +1 each time. So you could spend 2 diplomatic points to get +2 on one roll, or you could spend it to get +1 on 2 different rolls. If you don't have enough diplomatic points, you can spend 3 glory right now to get 1 diplomatic point. This is the only time in the game that you can do this, and you can only do it to get 1 diplomatic point per year. So I know that the eagle-eared among you are asking, wait, what did he mean when he said the nation is eligible to be rolled for? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But for now, let's just assume that you roll for each nation. So you roll a die, and on a 1 through a 5, modified by how many diplomatic points you spent, relations with that nation move 1 step towards hostile. If by contrast your result is 6 or greater after you apply the DRMs, relations with that nation stay the same. So the diplomatic situation with Spain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia is basically always trying to deteriorate, and you can only ever try to maintain the status quo with them. You cannot improve your relations with them in this way. You want allies, defeat them in a campaign, and maybe they'll pretend to be your friends for a brief period of time. Now, I will mention that you don't have to spend diplomatic points if you don't want to. And sometimes you actually want a relationship to get worse because it would be easier to deal with that nation by fighting them than talking to them. Not to mention that there's glory for the taking if you defeat them in a campaign. So you don't have to spend diplomatic points if you're hoping to fail a roll. But now let's go back to that phrase, eligible nation. And for this, we got to talk about treaties, which play a huge part in how the diplomatic situation plays out in I Napoleon. Treaties are usually placed when you determine the outcome of a campaign. So for example, if we look at this campaign, victory in this campaign causes you to play the Treaty of Luneville. So you would find the Treaty of Luneville, card 80, from the potential treaties area, and you're going to place it on the board. And you place treaties in this current treaties location box. Now, when you're placing a treaty after a campaign, you place it in this box face down. Now, I'm going to explain in just a second why that's the case, but just know that treaties in this box can be either face down or face up, and that impacts what happens when you get to the diplomacy phase. So in the diplomacy phase, if there's a face down treaty in the current treaties box, you look at the back of the card and it will tell you whose diplomatic roles you skip during this year. So in this case, it says I skip Austria and Russia's diplomacy roles for this year. So I won't be rolling for Austria or Prussia this year. Neither of them is eligible. And then once I've done that, once I've skipped them, I flip this card face up. So I know that probably sounds a bit wonky right now, or maybe a little fiddly, but if you think about it this way, I think it helps it make sense. Nations that you just defeated in a campaign will spend at least 1 year with stable relations with France, pretending to be their allies, before the diplomatic picture can start to change. So placing it face down and not rolling for them in the year in which you defeat them just kind of represents the effects of defeating them and the fact that they can't go back to hating you immediately. So now let's talk about face-up treaties. And face-up treaties operate a little bit differently in FCD and EMD. During FCD, most of the face-up treaties in the game have an ongoing effect, which tells you that that nation remains neutral until this card is removed sort of at the beginning of the Emperor era. So in this case, Austria would have been set to neutral, and you're just not going to roll for them anymore until this card is no longer in the current treaties box. During EMD, by contrast, a lot of the treaties have a triggered effect, which allows you to remove this card from play instead of shifting one of the nations that's named on it after a diplomacy roll. So in this case, when it's face up, I would still roll for Austria, Prussia, and Russia. So in this case, when this treaty is face down, I do not roll for Austria, Prussia, or Russia. But when this treaty is face up, I roll for all three of those nations, but if I get a result that would cause their relations with me to deteriorate, I can instead trigger the effect on this card, remove it from play, and I don't have to shift that nation. Now, it's really important that you remove it from play, and I'll explain why in a minute, but that's one of the key mechanisms in the EMD era. And I will mention that even though this card affects Austria, Prussia, and Russia, you don't get to use it for each of them. You get to use it once. So if one of them shifts and you decide to replace it, then the others, you don't have that protection against them shifting. Which brings us to Conquest. It is possible to conquer nations in the game. It's just not easy to do. Britain can be conquered, but it's a pretty remote possibility that requires a lot of things to go right. So I'm just going to tell you, go check the rulebook for a description of how Britain can be conquered. Similarly, Russia can't be conquered, but Russia can be set to inactive. And again, it requires a lot of things to go right, and you're better off going to check the rulebook for those specific rules than me trying to explain it. Spain can never be conquered. Spain is just an ulcer, but we'll get to that in the next video. Austria and Prussia, now they can be conquered. So let's talk about how that happens. Okay, so going back a bit, you remember we talked about you could trigger the effect on a treaty to avoid shifting, in this case, Prussia. But after doing so, you have to remove that treaty from the game. Well, after that's happened, if you resolve a campaign whose result tells you to play that treaty, and that treaty is no longer in the game, then instead you conquer that nation. So in this case, we would conquer Prussia. So you flip the marker over to its conquered side as a reminder that you're going to get 10 glory and 1 political point every single year. That's essentially an income effect now for you that you get every single year. And that nation is considered neutral when it comes time to pick a campaign for the year, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, but I can hear you thinking, wait a minute. They get to decide whether we're allied or hostile? Don't I get to decide? Well, yeah, as Napoleon, definitely. You get to decide sometimes whether you're hostile towards another nation or not. So in the diplomacy phase, if you want, you can take a treaty that's in the current treaties box, remove it from the game, and then set that nation to hostile. So this essentially gives you the ability to declare war on a nation by removing that treaty from the game. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, as it's implied, the reason is because you want to fight a campaign against that nation, but you don't want to wait for diplomacy rolls to deteriorate relations to hostile, and you can't fight a war against them if your relationship isn't hostile. Which brings us to the potential campaign segment, which happens at the very end of the diplomatic phase, which I will note is only during FCD and EMD. And it is how you decide what campaign you are going to fight in the next year of the game. How campaigns get placed during CMD happens during the card action phase. If you draw one, you'll place it there. But during FCD and EMD, you have some choice in what campaigns you fight. During FCD and EMD, you're going to check the potential campaigns area, and if there's a campaign there that matches the current diplomatic situation, you can take that campaign and put it in the campaign box, and that becomes the campaign that you as Napoleon are planning for next year. So for example, you could choose this campaign if Prussia's hostile, or this campaign if Spain is hostile, or this campaign if Spain is allied. Now, it can get a little trickier. There's more campaigns and more permutations during EMD, but there is a handy play aid that you can use to check for each state and which potential campaign you should select in that situation. Now, it's important to note that if something happens during another phase of the game, and by this we mostly mean the card action phase, but if something happens to change the diplomatic picture, then you would immediately check for a different potential campaign that matches the new situation. So if something happened which moved Austria to hostile, for example, I would switch Prussia declares war for Austria and Prussia declares war as the campaign for this year. Now, I will mention that most of the campaigns in the EMD, after they're resolved, you put them back into the potential campaigns area. You can fight those campaigns again and again and again. They're always available to you. And indeed, that's the way you conquer nations, is you fight the same campaign at least twice, removing the treaty in between, and then by defeating them, you conquer them. 4 of the campaigns during EMD, however, have the remove when played symbol on them. These can only happen once. So as soon as these are resolved, it counts as them having been played, and so you remove them from the game. Okay, we're done with diplomacy. Now we're on to domestic politics, which similarly only happens during FCD and EMD, when the messy political situation on the home front was complicating Napoleon's efforts to win the war. During this phase, you're going to roll a die and apply the die roll modifiers shown in this chart, and then look up on this chart, and it will tell you how much glory you lose because of the messy diplomatic situation in France. The modifiers, you get -1 for each hostile, conquered, or inactive nation. Britain is always hostile. You get -1 for each bloody result that occurred in combat, and you would get -1 if continental system was in the France location box. By contrast, you'll get a +1 for each allied nation, and you can get +1 for every 2 political points you spend at this moment. If you need an extra political point, you can spend 2 admin points or 3 glory during this phase, and only during this phase, to get 1 and only 1 political point. You have leftover admin points, you may as well spend those here since they're going away soon anyway. Which leads us to the cleanup phase, where you're going to kind of reset the board and get ready for the next year. If you have any face down treaties in the current treaties location box, you flip them face up. Most of these will have gotten flipped up during the diplomacy phase, but if you happen to forget one, you can flip it up. You flip Napoleon's luck back to its unused side, so you can use it again next year. You reset admin and diplomatic points to 0. Politics and glory do not reset. And if that was the last year of the game, you would then check for an outcome. But assuming it's not, you basically go back to the top of the sequence of play and perform the year setup phase for the next year, and then continue onwards. So in the next video, we're going to cover the 2 phases we skipped here, the 2 main phases of the game. The card action phase, in which you determine what sort of events occur in that year of Napoleon's life, and the campaign resolution phase, where you determine Napoleon's fate on the campaign and on the battlefield. After we cover those in the next video, I'm also going to do an example of play so you can see how all of this plays out in practice. Thanks for joining us for this How to Play I Napoleon video. If you've enjoyed the video, it would be really appreciated if you would leave a like on it. If you're enjoying the channel, it'd be great if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell so you find out when there's new content. And if you think there's someone who would also appreciate the video, you could share it with them. All of those things really help the channel. But we will see you next time in the next video on Agility Snips Gaming Table.